Traumatized veterans returning from our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are often diagnosed as suffering from a psychological disorder and prescribed a regimen of psychotherapy and psychiatric drugs. But psychologist Paula Caplan, in her new book, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, asks, why is it a mental illness to be devastated by war? What is a mentally healthy response to death, destruction, and moral horror? Caplan argues that the standard treatment of therapy and drugs is often actually harmful. It adds to veterans' burdens by making them believe wrongly that they should have gotten over it. It isolates them behind the closed doors of the therapist's office, and it makes them rely on often harmful drugs. Caplan proposes an alternative, that we, all of us, welcome veterans back into our communities and listen to their stories one-on-one. These are not the first or the only contrarian thoughts of Paula J. Caplan. She often challenges conventional wisdom and established authority, as she did in 2 earlier books, You're Smarter Than They Make You Feel, How the Experts Intimidate Us and What We Can Do About It, and They Say You're Crazy, How the World's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Normal.
I want to say Terrence McNally titled that book.
I did. Paula called me and said, I've got this book, this is what it's about, what should I call it? And
there it was great.
They Say You're Crazy.
Right.
I'm going to quote Paula in a recent blog post to sort of set up her positioning. This is a lengthy quote, but I think you'll get the point. In much of my work, I believe that I'm in the middle of the road, plodding along, looking at theories, research, and how they affect people in their daily lives, drawing attention to poor research and conclusions that are unwarranted by research data or to hurtful practices in the mental health system. And I believe that I'm steering a middle course between, on the one hand, those who insist that scientists have or will at some point have all of the answers people need in order to find happiness and strength, and on the other hand, those who believe that science has no merit. What I believe is that scientists have sometimes produced wonderfully helpful information, but that disturbingly much of what passes for science is not good science, does not offer us glimpses of truth because it is so poorly designed, so biased, or both, and that there is much that matters in life about which scientists currently have little to offer. Paula J. Caplan, a clinical and research psychologist, is currently affiliate at the Dubois Institute and fellow at the Women and Public Policy program at the Kennedy School of Government, both at Harvard University. She's been a lecturer at Harvard, a professor of applied psychology, and head of the Center for Women's Studies and Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She's the author of 12 books, including Don't Blame Mother, Mending the Mother-Daughter Relationship, You're Smarter Than They Make You Feel, They Say You're Crazy, and her latest, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, How All of Us Can Help Veterans. Paula, by the way, is also a playwright.
I'm so glad to be here.
Very good. Now, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we're going to deal with on the show. So can you share briefly your path to the work that you do today? Not so much this latest book as much as just the whole scope of your work, and feel free to note mentors or turning points along the way.
Yes. Well, I was raised in a family that valued critical thinking, really encouraged it, said whenever you don't understand something or don't know, speak up and ask, and also that valued concern about the underdog, about people who were mistreated or oppressed. Then I got to Harvard in your class.
That's right.
And Bruce Baker, who then went to UCLA, because he was too good a teacher for Harvard, Bruce Baker taught a wonderful course on critical thinking about psychology. And what he would do was very interesting. He would assign us articles that we said, oh, these are classics. And then he would say, write a short paper about everything wrong with them. And we'd say, excuse me, but these are classics. They'll be perfect. And he said, write a short paper about everything wrong with them. And we would find things that were wrong. And so that really propelled me down the path of asking questions about what I read in psychology, whether it was about research or whether I also became a clinician, whether it was about what goes on in therapy and how we can really help people. So that's the short version. I should say also that I got kicked out of my clinical PhD program in psychology at Duke University at the end of my first year. And that was because when I asked why, because my grades were good and so on, they said, well, you have weak ego boundaries. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And I asked, and my advisor, John Cooey, said, well, you know, for example, we think if you're talking to a woman who's depressed, you'd probably say, oh, you poor thing, and then just leave it at that. And I was stunned. I said, but John, in the interviewing course that you taught, you gave me an A. You said that my interviewing skills were good. I would never do anything like, just leave it at that. And I didn't understand what was going on. So years later, I became a feminist, and I started thinking about this through the lens of gender. And I thought, I get it. I was one of 2 women in that class, and I was the only one of the 2 who was expressive. And they didn't know what to do with that. And I was also questioning. I wasn't challenging, because I would sit there and nod and yes at everything everybody said. I could see merit in everything, but I did raise questions. And so as they saw it, I was challenging their authority and I was expressive. So they better call me something that sounded wrong, bad, unprofessional. So weak ego boundaries, that was a fancy way of saying you're expressive, you don't know where you end and the next person
That's right.
begins.
Boundary issues.
Boundary issues. Yeah, it drives me crazy. So I got very interested in labeling in that way.
Of course.
And then later on, and this actually leads eventually to the current book about veterans, later on I had written a book called The Myth of Women's Masochism. And I don't know about other people, but every time I write a book or an article, when it's about to come out, I think, I don't know why I wrote that. And I either think I must be wrong or everybody already knows it.
Right.
So I'm an idiot. Right. And just when I was in that state, I got a call from the late Jean Baker Miller, brilliant psychiatrist. And she said, did you hear what the writers of the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual are about to do? The manual is called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Sounds like science, right? They were proposing some new categories that were going to treat women's behavior specifically as though it were mental illnesses, things that women are socialized to do. Put other people's needs ahead of your own. Then we'll say you have self-defeating personality disorder, right? It was a catch-22. So that's how I got involved in the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, which I had been taught was science. Well, I sat there in those meetings. I ended up on 2 of their committees for a while, and I was horrified because their use of science was appalling. They played fast and loose. Now, I'm going to use the next word very carefully. They would lie about the research. They would distort it. They would ignore it if it didn't fit with what they wanted. And that's when I saw that the way we label people isn't based in science. It's political and it's arbitrary.
It's interesting how very personal experiences lead you to the things that you then focus on in your work. Let's deal, as I said, first with some of your work in the broader field of psychology and psychiatry. Would you like to expand a bit on the quote that I read, and you were just beginning to? The quote in the intro about science, what is true science, what's the abuse of science, the misuse of science, and all of that.
Yes, and I want to say first that every time I hear you say a world that just might work, I get tears in my eyes. It's so beautiful and it's so compact. And that's what a lot of my work is about, is longing for a world that works better and that treats people in more humane and helpful ways. So the reason that I get so upset when things masquerade as science, but they're really hurting people, is because it's bad enough to do hurtful things to people. But when you do it in the name of science, then it's a lot harder for those who are hurt or who care about them to pull back and say, wait a minute, maybe there's another way. Maybe we shouldn't be saying, well, the psychiatrists and the psychologists are scientists and they do objective work and they know how to fix people who are suffering. And so that's why it's so upsetting to me. When I was on those 2 committees for the diagnostic manual,
let's back up just a second and tell people what the DSM is.
Okay.
And if you've ever been in a psychologist or a psychiatrist's office, it's on the bookshelf right behind them. But what is the DSM?
Well, and it's not just on the bookshelf. You've been given at least one label that's up in that book. It's called the Therapist Bible, colloquially, because every therapist has to use it if they want reimbursement from an insurance company or from Medicare or Medicaid. And it's a huge tome. I weighed it on my scale. It weighs 3 pounds, and it contains 374 different categories that are supposedly mental illnesses. I counted. And one of the things that's really interesting is they keep coming out with new editions. And every time they come out with a new edition, it gets bigger. There are more categories, and it looks like scientists are discovering more mental illnesses all the time. No, they're manufacturing them. They're thinking them up. The drug companies are making them up now.
Let me ask you a question. They do take some out as well, don't they?
Almost never. They'll change the names, for example. But let me give you one example. When I first got involved with the DSM, it was back in 1985, and one of the two categories that was of great concern, they were proposing for the first time, and let me tell you, this was apparently thought up by two guys on a fishing trip, and it was premenstrual dysphoric disorder. This is not bloating and breast tenderness and chocolate cravings. This is mental illness just before your period. And of course, only women qualify for it. So they're pathologizing women, treating them like they're sick. And so the problem with that, there are all kinds of problems. One related to the science was there were hundreds of studies that had been done about premenstrual this and that. Almost none of them by the manual's own committee on PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, by their own conclusions, their written conclusions. They said almost none of these hundreds of studies has anything to do with whether there's a mental illness. Most of them are about just the physical things.
Sure.
And they said those few that have anything to do with whether there's a mental illness are very preliminary, and they have terrible methodological problems.
So they said that themselves.
They said that themselves. Now, what do you think would follow from that if you're a real scientist? You have to recommend to the editor of the next edition.
I would think at best further study.
Right, further study, right. Well, there was so much outcry that they couldn't put it in the regular book, but they created an appendix for the first time for categories requiring further study. And they announced publicly they put PMDD in there. Well, it turned out, yes, they did, but there were some problems. One was there was no warning sign, no black box that said, but don't apply this label to anybody because we don't even know if it's real. We don't even know if women do get mentally ill right before their periods. Some get irritable, some get sad. But you know what? It turns out men on a cyclical basis often have mood changes at least as extreme as those that the average woman has. So there were all kinds of problems with this, but they put it in there and people have used it all the time. And the FDA went ahead and approved one drug after another to treat it when it had not even been proven to exist.
So what you're saying there, one thing I hear is that when something finds itself into that volume in whatever way, even as an appendix requiring further study, it then becomes a label that people use, people diagnose, people prescribe based on it, and so on. Now, it does seem to me that one of the things, always it seems to me on this show, in unraveling mysteries, especially mysteries of injustice or that sort of thing, it's follow the money.
Yes.
Now, in this case, it seems that a clinician could say, but I'm doing you a favor if I say you've got this mental illness. Don't feel bad about that. It's the only way I can get our time together covered and the medication that I'm going to give you covered.
Right. Okay. Couple of things. We could do 6 hours just on PMDD, but I'll try to be brief. One is that it is true that under the current system, the way in the United States to get insurance coverage is to get one of those labels. There are ways it's been done in other places. There are very simple things people could do, because what a lot of caring therapists do is they say, this person is feeling upset. They deserve to have their help paid for by their insurance. So I'll give them the closest label I can find, right? Well, now, that wouldn't be so bad, except that because mental illness is stigmatized, you can be there and you can be the therapist and you can say, don't feel bad about having this label. But you know what? People do feel badly about themselves. They think I'm broken and I need to be fixed. And I can talk till the cows come home about how you're not mentally ill, and they still think they are.
So isn't part of it that we're in a sort of a gray area or a transition point where mental health, mental illness, all of that is more out of the closet than it used to be?
Yes.
So that people will seek help where they didn't used to, but yet we're not so far advanced that there isn't stigma involved and self-stigma.
Right. And there's not just stigma. There's a whole list of other kinds of harm. People have lost custody of their children because of getting just about any label, because it's in the manual of mental disorders, so they're mentally ill by fiat. By the way, the European Union's equivalent of the FDA looked at the same research on PMDD that the FDA looked at, and they sent out a letter saying absolutely do not use this label because the research shows it's not even a real entity. All right, so politics and, as you say, money are involved. Secondly, think about this. What drugs were being approved by the FDA to treat this PMDD? They were all the so-called antidepressants. Now, you know what? If you feel better on an antidepressant, what does that tell us? It tells us that you were feeling sad, you were feeling despondent. And if, as the therapist, a woman comes to me and I diagnose her with PMDD and I put her on an antidepressant, instead of saying, if this works, then it's quite possible that you are feeling sad, you're potentially feeling suicidal. That's really serious, and we need to call it what it is instead of saying, well, it's probably something vaguely hormonal. There hasn't been any real connection made between hormonal changes and this kind of alleged mental illness. So we are treating people without their consent on the basis of no science, because we're not saying to them, nobody's ever proven there's such a thing as PMDD. We're saying, I'm going to give you this label and I'm going to prescribe a drug for you on that basis. And the other thing that was happening to me during those years when I was discovering what's wrong with psychiatric labeling is that I was hearing from so many people who said, I lost the right to make decisions about my medical and legal affairs because I had a label. I lost a job. My health insurance skyrocketed because now I had a pre-existing condition. So there's real harm going on. And I heard from people who said, I was feeling down. I got diagnosed with PMDD or something else. I was put on antidepressants. I got more depressed and tried to kill myself.
Right. In other words, the other piece of this is that we've talked about overdiagnosis.
Yeah.
Then there's over-medication.
That's right.
And over-medication is where we get into some very dangerous areas. Right. I did a show recently with Gabor Mate,
yes,
who you must be aware of, and he certainly, from a physician's point of view, echoes very much. I was just reminded, echoes very much what you're saying right now. I'm Terrence McNally. She's Paula J. Caplan. We're talking about some of her earlier work in books like They Say You're Crazy, How the World's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Normal. And we will talk about her latest, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, How All of Us Can Help Veterans. You can learn more about that one at whenjohnnyandjanecomemarching.weebly.com. I realize we can't spend forever on it, but let me read you just one thing. I'm going to talk about listening later, but you point out that what's happened to therapy, and you refer in an essay to a March 5th, 2011 New York Times article. Talk doesn't pay. Again, follow the money. So psychiatry turns instead to drug therapy. And it describes a psychiatrist can earn $150 for 3 15-minute medication visits, compared with $90 for a 45-minute talk therapy session. In New York City, a select group of psychiatrists charge $600 or more per hour to treat investment bankers and the very wealthy, and top child psychiatrists charge $2,000 or more for initial evaluations. But very many therapists have stopped talking, have stopped listening, and have started doing just what you get when you go to an HMO, where you get a very quick listening, quick diagnosis, quick medication, you leave with a prescription. This is now what much of therapy is?
Yes.
Or as the psychiatrist in the New York Times article they focus on says, well, I don't do therapy anymore.
That's right. That's right. That's happening more and more. But I want to make a couple of things clear. One is that there are some good therapists who are listening and who are very effective. Now, it's not enough for most war veterans, which we'll get to, and it's not enough for a lot of people with other kinds of problems as well. And part of what concerns me is that in the last couple of decades, we've become an increasingly psychiatrized society. And that is because of certain talk shows and certain other publicity agents, we have come to believe that if you feel anything other than happy, you have a mental illness and you need a therapist to fix it. Other people can't. I don't know what happened to friendship. Friends think, oh, her boyfriend dumped her and she was devastated, but I didn't listen to her because I'm not a therapist, so I guess I wouldn't know what to do. And people wrongly assume that therapists know how to fix all kinds of problems, which we don't. I went through training as a therapist after I got kicked out of graduate school. I had 4 years of training and then an internship. I have trained therapists myself. I've done therapy for years. I don't do it anymore. And I can tell you that if you weren't pretty good at this to start with, then the training doesn't help very much. And so there just are a lot of limitations that many therapists have. Please don't finish listening to this cast and thinking that, well, Paula thinks that nobody should ever go to a therapist and no therapist ever helps. I don't believe that. But if it were enough, we wouldn't be seeing ads on TV saying, are you already taking 3 antidepressants and you're still depressed? No, well, try another one. Or if you're going to therapy and that's not enough, then try something else. Buy a psychiatrist or buy a psychologist. We have to start turning more to the community, to other people, and to friends, just like happens in many other cultures where the community says, whatever has happened to you that has devastated you, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's having been at war, whether it's your boyfriend dumped you, we will take some responsibility for helping you to heal and come back into the community.
Let's talk. So I do want to, before we move on, I do want to kind of see where we end up on that DSM question. So the DSM, and I do want you to, if people are interested in that area, and I assume some of you are, that they can find your blogs and things on paulajcaplan.net, right?
Well, I'm blogging for Psychology Today.
And Psychology.
Right. And if you look at, the blogs aren't on the Paula J. Caplan, but if you go to Psychology Today and type in Paula J. Caplan with a C, then you'll see I blog about a whole lot of things, but there are quite a few about the DSM.
And the DSM is right now going through a process of coming up with a new edition. This would be DSM-5.
Yes, right? and that's one of the things. I've been saying this since the late 1980s. Every time there's a new edition, which happens every 7 to 10 years, when that a new edition comes out, the media people say to the editor of whatever edition it is, "Doctor, why did we need a new edition of DSM?" And like clockwork, the editor says very seriously and solemnly, because the previous one wasn't really scientific. Even in one case, that person was the editor of the previous edition. And the person who edited the current edition, Alan Francis, it's a fascinating story. He was editor of DSM-4, the current edition, and he was a real advocate of it.
And so let me just point out, the current edition is, what we mean by that is the DSM-4. That is the one people are using today.
That's right. That's right. And guess what? Alan Francis is now blogging for Psychology Today, and he has come right out and said, we made so many mistakes. It was so unscientific. We should never have put bipolar disorder in there. It's a wastebasket term. Children are over-medicated. Infants are being diagnosed with this. He has come out with a string of mea culpas, as has the editor of the 2 previous editions, Robert Spitzer. So it's very interesting that they've come around. I'm not quite sure why, but when the new edition is in preparation, it's important to know that for the first time ever, people who are on the work group who are making these changes were asked to sign a confidentiality agreement. Now, how's this for science, which is supposed to be open and above board and anybody can scrutinize? Sign a confidentiality agreement. They're not supposed to tell anybody
what goes on in the deliberations.
Right. What is that about? And guess what else? Because they were so criticized for previous editions that the people on the committees, most of them, the vast majority, had close ties to drug companies, made a fortune from the drug companies. Well, now you have to divest yourself of all your financial ties to the drug companies, over $10,000 a year, so you still get the $10,000, and you only have to divest for the period of time you're actually on the committee. Now, what in the world good does that do?
So as soon as you contribute to the newest version,
you can go right back.
You can go right back to getting paid off by the pharmaceutical companies. It's just like what happens in government.
Yes.
You help something pass a committee, and then you retire and go to work for whoever you just helped.
That's right.
This is scary stuff. If people want to learn more about the DSM, about all of that stuff, they can find that at Psychology Today. And now, right now, I know they're asking for comment.
Yes.
Is it only professionals who can comment?
No, absolutely anybody. And I hope that people will.
Okay.
But I hope that people won't just put comments on the DSM website, which is DSM5, Arabic numeral 5.org. But I hope you will gather petitions, send out emails, send letters to the editor, have as public a protest as you can, because unfortunately, if history is any guide, they won't really pay much attention to all these thousands of comments that they're getting. Oh, and I have to say this. I started to say before, they proposed premenstrual dysphoric disorder as just an example back in 1985. Then they put it in this appendix requiring further study. What they didn't tell us publicly was at that time, they also put it in the main text. Now, what do they have on the DSM5.org website right now? In the first paragraph on the homepage, it says, and we're proposing some new categories like premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I don't know why they would say it's new, but it's something fishy that's going on there.
Okay, so if you want to learn more, if you want to contribute, if you want to comment, this is a big issue. And let me allow you to say one other thing. We're getting very close to the halfway point here. One, I noticed more than once as I looked at your stuff, you tried to position yourself a certain way because you have been taken as a hero by Scientology.
Oh, God. Yes. Okay. I am advised by my lawyer to be very careful what I say because of the way the Scientologists operate. Okay. But I can tell you this. I wrote an article that was published online in Counterpunch some years ago in which I said that the Scientologists, through their Citizens Commission on Human Rights, doesn't that sound like a good title? They submitted an amicus brief in a Supreme Court case, the U.S. Supreme Court, in which they mischaracterized and misapplied some of my work from They Say You're Crazy. Unfortunately, I guess Justice Souter, who wrote the majority decision in that case, didn't check out who is the CCHR, and he took exactly what their argument was and applied it with disastrous consequences for people who have committed crimes but who are seriously emotionally troubled. And I can also tell you that a part of an interview, a very tiny clip taken out of context of an interview I did with them when they said, no, we're not connected to Scientology, appears in a DVD they send out called Psychiatry, an Industry of Death. And I asked that be taken out of the film because it was taken out of context and because they got the interview with me by saying they weren't connected with Scientology. It's still in there. And what scares me is that a lot of people are jumping on board because they have the money. The Scientologists have the money. They're producing all these slick films and videos and that are really good, and there's something to them in their critique in some ways of psychiatry and psychology. But of course, what they want you to do is to come to Scientology. I certainly wouldn't advise anybody to do that. I would say, please be very careful and stay away.
Okay. Yeah, I've had some experience with that myself. An associate who was a complementary psychiatrist who dealt in broadly in the field they thought maybe she was an ally as well. And so
Yes.
there's this thing that if you are critical of some aspects of psychiatry and psychology, you may then turn out to be recruited, as it were. I'm going to read a quote that you quote from Studs Terkel. So the first thing I'd say is listen. It's the second thing I'd say too, and the third, and the fourth. And if you do, people will talk. They'll always talk. Why? Because no one has ever listened to them before in all of their lives. Perhaps they've not ever even listened to themselves.
Yes,
Paula.
that's so beautiful. He really says it all. I got interested in war veterans' experiences partly because my father, my late father, was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was captain of an all-black artillery battery. And every year around Christmas time, he would talk about what it was like to be out there in the cold and the snow, surrounded by the Nazis. But it was never about his heroism. It was never about his being scared. It was never about the horrors of war. It was about how fine his men were. My father was the gentlest soul who ever walked the earth. And all the time I was growing up, I couldn't figure out why every year in December I would hear the same stories, and it was as though I was hearing them for the first time. It wouldn't stick. Some years ago, a friend videotaped my father telling these stories, and I sat down alone to watch the videotape. And at one point I had to turn it off because I was crying. And it was right after my father said, for a period of time I was a forward observer. And for the first time that term forward observer got through. There was this image I had of my father, my gentle father, out there alone. So vulnerable, and he could have died. And it was devastating. And I ended up writing a play called Shades about this, which is actually going to have a reading in L.A. on August 26th through the L.A. Women's Theater Project. Anyway, that was one stream through which I started getting interested in veterans' experience.
Let me just share, by the way, my father, who passed away 2 years ago, was a veteran in World War II, a bombardier, shot down, and spent the last several months in a POW camp. And through most of my life, I heard nothing about his experiences until, and that's why I was struck when I saw what you said about your father, until the last few years, actually. The last few years, he got more open. Part of it was that he was asked by a PBS station in Atlanta to talk about his experiences, and what he did in that hour and a half or so interview was much more than I'd ever heard. So the similarity is very interesting, and one wonders, my guess is that they make a certain decision when they first come home what they'll tell the family.
Yes.
And it never changes. Yeah. And then, 40 years later, someone else says, well, tell me what happened, and someone's asking, they open up. But once he did that, he was much more forthcoming with us as well. So
yes, and that raises a couple of issues, which is, why do vets not talk when they come home? And there are three reasons. Why do vets not talk, and why do civilians not tend to listen or to ask? The three main reasons that vets tell me that they don't talk is, one is they think they're crazy. And they're afraid if they talk, you'll think they're crazy. Because what does it look like? You look around you, and there are all these vets here, and in history, millions of veterans have gotten through it as far as they know. And there each one is, and in their own head, they're thinking, how come I can't sleep at night? How come I'm so jumpy? How come I feel so filled with rage? How come I have
How come I can't get over it?
I can't get over it? Exactly. So they think there must be something wrong with me because I'm overreacting. And so that's one of the reasons they don't talk. They think they're crazy, and they're afraid you'll find out. And they'll be isolated even more. Secondly, they are afraid that you won't understand. What if they try to talk, and since you weren't there, you don't understand, and then the chasm they experience between the two of you will feel even wider and unbridgeable. And then the other reason is that a lot of veterans, whether they joined up because they wanted to fight a war or because, like my father, they got drafted, the whole image was, if you're a soldier, you're over there to protect your loved ones and to protect deserving people in the world. So they'll come home and they will think, look at me. look how I am feeling. Do I want to make my loved ones feel this? Why should I tell them about all the horror I saw? And so I think that's one reason that your father talked to PBS but didn't talk to you, because it's less scary, and they feel less responsible for potentially hurting the listener. Why do civilians not tend to ask? And by the way, just about every vet said, those who do ask if I want to talk about it, the only thing they say is, did you kill anybody? And there is no good answer to that, right? And so civilians often don't ask because of our psychiatrized society. They will tell me, well, I don't ask because I'm sure it must have been upsetting and I won't know what to do. And I'm not a therapist. And so there we are again. Whatever happened to friendship? And in the book, I talk about how we are a war illiterate nation. Fewer than 1% of Americans have ever even served in the military, never mind going to war. And that means that 99% of us haven't a clue what it's really like to be there. Even veterans from all wars who said, I played with toy soldiers as a kid, my father and my grandfather were in the war, and the women who said, I really wanted to go and defend this country and protect our freedoms, didn't matter how gung-ho pro-war they were, or defend whatever they were, they said, basic training, advanced military training, nothing prepares you for what it's really like to be at war. And so if they feel that way, how much less are we able to appreciate? I don't care if you're anti-war or pro a particular war. Most of us really don't know what it is we're talking about. And so we have a lot to learn as a nation. We need to become a war-literate nation, educate ourselves and each other so that next time our government wants to take us to war, whether we're for it or against it, we really know what we're talking about instead of listening to slogans. And we know that war and being a soldier is not just about a clean-cut uniform and caring about your country and defending all sorts of good things. It's about hell. It's about terror. It's about grief and guilt and moral anguish and existential conflicts that may never leave you.
Right. That's the voice of Paula J. Caplan. We're talking about her book, When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home, How All of Us Can Help Veterans. Now, you say in your book that you avoided this book for years, and then you just said that experience with your father led you to do it. What did you set out to do with this book, and how did you, who are not a veteran, how did you feel that you knew enough that you could write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, there was a second stream that brought me to this book, and that was I was at a conference of the Association for Women in Psychology right before the Iraq War started. And Maureen McHugh, who was the coordinator, said in a meeting, we all know this war is coming. And I was trying to think, is there anything that we as psychologists can do? And all of a sudden, I had this image. It was like watching a movie of veterans pouring back from this next war. And I thought, oh, my God, I know what's going to happen. Since the last war, our country has become more psychiatrized. People are going to be coming back, and they're going to experience this emotional carnage that war causes most people. And the whole country is going to say, oh, we know what that is. It's a mental illness, and for most of them, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, and we know what works. Send them to therapists and send them for drugs. So that was what I was scared to death would happen, and unfortunately, it's proven to be truer on a greater scale than I had even feared.
Yeah, you point out that in what we used to call, what we now call PTSD, at least had, well, for one thing, it wasn't an acronym. It wasn't just a set of letters, and that it had something more to do with war.
Yes, that's right. In the Civil War, I just learned this recently, in the Civil War, they called war trauma soldier's heart. All right, so there was the presence of war in the word soldier. Starting in World War I, they talked about shell shock, battle fatigue, combat trauma, all right? War was very clearly stated as that's what happened to this person. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, a couple of problems with that. One is, where's the presence of war?
Right.
You could be hit by a bus. You could have been raped. You could have been in a tsunami.
I mean, I've done some work on this, actually, and surgery.
Yes.
Surgery creates PTSD in lots of people.
Yeah.
I mean, in major surgery.
Well, see, and I don't want to use the term
Right.
PTSD. I want to say surgically caused emotional trauma, because you're going to try to help a rape victim differently from a surgical trauma survivor or a survivor of war trauma. It's, in other words, as individuals, I think it's incumbent upon us, and as a nation, and as a mental health system, not to distance ourselves from that person's experience. How are we going to understand if we're helping mask the fact that war is what caused this
And then
condition?
you raise another question, which is that we have the tendency to give them that label so that they can get treatment, so that they can get reimbursed, all that craziness. But what you're saying is, who is to say what is a healthy response to the horrors and the anguish of war?
That's right. That's right. And I did an interview a few weeks ago with WNYC, and this psychiatrist called in, and he was saying, oh, it's a mental illness. It's a mental illness. And I said, can you explain what you mean by that? And he said, well, disease, it's like, a part of your body is broken. And so in this case, part of their brain is broken. And I said, so that's why you would call it a mental illness. Then can you tell me what would be a healthy response to war? And he couldn't say. And there isn't an answer, right? That is a rhetorical question. And I think for us to say that to be devastated by war is a mental illness is, again, to cover up what war really does. And when we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, I tell you, Terry, I was late rushing to the studio today. I was caught in traffic, and that was stress. Stress doesn't begin to describe what going through a war experience does to you. And so, again, we're soft pedaling it. This is a euphemism. We should be able to say to veterans and to anybody who's been traumatized, I believe every word you tell me about what you went through and how you are suffering, and it's not a mental illness. I would feel that way.
Right. Now, you actually say that it's a difficult question for people. How do you respond? Because one of the things people say is, well, when you say, I understand you're suffering from PTSD, you're suffering from this mental disorder. So now they actually feel, they've got a handle on something. It's not their unique problem. And there's treatment for it and so on. You say we could do much the same thing without telling them that they're mentally ill for feeling the way they do.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, if somebody close to you dies, which is part of the trauma of war, you lose your innocence because you're 19 years old and you may never have lost anybody, and you see your friend with whom you went through basic training blown in half by an IED. How do you deal with that grief? And so when you tell somebody that's what you've been through, even if they've never lost anybody, it's a little easier for them to understand why you're having such a hard time since you've come home. And we should not be saying, I will listen to you and I will believe that you're suffering and I will try to help and support you, but you have to let me call you mentally ill first. That's what, as a nation, we're doing. That really is it in a nutshell. And would you read a poem for me? There's a Vietnam veteran named David E. Jones who has a book of beautiful, exquisite poetry called A Soldier's Story, The Power of Words. And in that book, I quoted a lot of his poetry because he says so many things much more beautifully than I could.
Now, by the way, you point out that David Jones, who wrote these poems, his war was the Vietnam War.
That's
right. And yet these poems were written, some of them many years after.
Many years
right.
after. That's
so
right.
Here's just one thing he says. You'd think for me my war has passed. Pay attention. It has not. What troubles me now is a blood-soaked dream. Can't stop the flow at will. As thousands of vets, we fear the worst, mirrored in the wall for us still. So what he's saying is that dream, that blood-soaked dream, is alive for me.
That's right.
This many years later. And you had me read that because you're saying that's the kind of thing that so many feel. I know one thing that's true is that these current wars, these Iraq and Afghanistan, are in some sense more harrowing than even Vietnam for a couple of reasons. One is that they are sent back so often.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But the other is that you are really you don't know who is your ally, that began to happen in Vietnam,
yes,
but even more so in these wars. So the hair trigger, the suspicion, all of that is worse.
Mm-hmm.
And suicides. Give just a little bit of what's going on with suicides.
Well, suicides keep going up, and let me just say a couple of things. One is, if you asked me, is being in a particular war worse than being in any other particular war, I couldn't really set a list of which is worse. Vietnam was worse in some ways. World War II was worse in some ways, although people felt they were fighting someone who was clearly a monster, and you knew clearly who the enemy was. So I don't want to have a hierarchy of suffering. All of these vets are suffering. But one of the things that happens is that people who have been in previous wars and feel it was a good war, like World War II, feel like they don't have the right to complain. So in that way, it's harder for them. People from Vietnam feel like, well, that was a war we lost, and a lot of people hated us for going, and some of us chose to go, and some of us didn't resist the draft when we should have or could have. And so they feel that they were already demeaned, so they're isolated for that reason. But in these Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a lot of people are isolated because nobody but their generation of service members has been through as many deployments and as much confusion about who the enemy is, and certain kinds of problems that they didn't have back then. When people came back from World War II and Vietnam, they didn't have these high unemployment rates. Right. And also the fact that it's so much easier now than it was before to say, and you're all mentally ill, distances them even more and increases their torment, which is what that poem of Dave Jones
and
is about.
The other difference that we know is that there was a draft for World War II, and there was still a draft for Vietnam. So people were more likely throughout society to know someone who'd gone.
That's right.
And nowadays it really is that it's really out of sight, out of mind for so many people.
Well, right, and through the No Child Left Behind Act, strangely enough, military recruiters have the right to go into high schools and recruit people. Well, they tend selectively to go into lower income high schools, and so people who need jobs, who have fewer connections through their families for getting jobs, are more likely to go into the military, and when they get out, they still don't have those connections to get jobs. So with the unemployment rate already high, it's even harder for them to get jobs than for some previous generations of the military. So it's another thing that's absolutely devastating. And one of the reasons that I want to have a national war literacy project.
In this book, you've found one, maybe we don't need to be calling it mental illness. Mm-hmm. 2, maybe we don't need to just seek all our help from psychiatrists. Right. 3, maybe we don't need to medicate a veteran who is suffering these horrors. Putting that aside, what can we do, and what is your prescription, as it were, for us as well as for them?
Okay. Well, let me just begin by saying that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals handed down a decision just a few weeks ago saying that they order the VA's mental health system to undergo a complete overhaul. They use the word shameful to describe the service. I know some VA therapists who are wonderful and very caring, but the system as a whole is failing. General Peter Corelli, who's vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has been publicly expressing concern about the effects of medication. They're not taking care of war trauma, and they're making people worse, and he even said they're killing them. Interaction effects, very dangerous stuff. The VA and the military have been saying for years now, we don't understand. We keep implementing more treatment programs, and this for the families, and this for the vets, and so on. And the suicide rates keep going up, the homelessness, the joblessness, the substance abuse, the family breakdown. We just don't know why it's happening. So what that tells us is, even if every therapist at the VA and in the military is terrific, and even if every therapist out in the rest of the world is terrific and trying to help vets, We are failing. We need more. Now,
Or other.
Or other. I would say other, but even if, then we certainly need to be doing other things. So at no cost, if every civilian would interview a vet, listen to their story, it makes a huge difference. Let me tell you what I suggest, and let me tell you what the vets have said that it does. It's very, very simple. Chapter 6 is all about how to do the interviews, but most of it isn't stuff you need to learn. I suggest that whatever your politics and whatever the vet's politics, you say that as an American whose government sent you to war, I take some responsibility for listening to what you experienced over there and how it's been for you since you came home. And I will listen if you want to talk to me. I will listen for as long as you want to talk, and I will not judge. That's it in a nutshell. And most of the rest of the time, as Studs Terkel said, just listen. Don't comment. Don't interpret. Don't even ask questions. Just listen, but listen with all your heart and with every bit of your mind and concentration. And your respect for them will come through, and it will matter. The one thing I suggest that people look for a chance to say, and the vets tell me it really matters, that's why I think it's important, is when they've told you something horrible they experienced, take the opportunity to say, if I had been through what you just told me you went through, I don't think I'd be able to sleep at night. I think I'd hit the floor when a truck backfires. I don't think you're crazy. I don't think you're mentally ill. I think you're having an understandable, normal human reaction. And that often makes more of a difference than anything else you could possibly say. And I also suggest don't interview, if it's the first time they've talked, don't interview somebody in the family.
Right.
All right? Go interview somebody else. If your father was in Vietnam or your mother, have somebody outside the family
by the way,
interview them
let's
the first
be clear.
time.
What you've just said reminds me, you're not talking about just the Iraq and Afghanistan vets.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And also there's a whole piece about what it's like to be a woman vet, how it's different from being a male vet and how it's similar in other ways. But that's the whole different piece of it. All right, so you listen to them. Now, what have the veterans told me? I've interviewed vets from every war since World War II. And everyone tells me this, some of them about the interviews we've done, some about interviews that they've done with other people, or just outreach from the community. They've said, when I told my story, or when somebody reached out to me and connected, that night I slept for the first time since I got back from Iraq or Vietnam. Let me tell you real quickly, Michelle Dillow is in the Army. She went to Iraq, she came home. Now she's in Afghanistan. She gives me permission to use her name. My short play, War and Therapy, is about what we're just talking about. She said in between her deployments, she was asked to speak to a college class at Missouri State University. And she was talking about the trouble she had. She wasn't a good enough soldier. She wasn't tough enough. She was upset when a friend of hers got blown apart by an IED. And she was berating herself. And some student she'd never spoken to in the back of the classroom calls out and says, I think you're being too hard on yourself. And Michelle stopped in her tracks. Here was somebody who had nothing to gain, just reaching out and connecting and offering this gift. And Michelle said that night she slept for the first time since she got back from Iraq. Now, listening to a vet, reaching out, doesn't make it all okay, doesn't make them heal completely, but it's a really important step. Many vets told me that even if a therapist was nice and somewhat helpful, they say, but I don't live in their office. I have to live out in the world. I need to be able to connect with the wider community. And so it's been incredibly moving to hear their stories. I thought that because my politics are at one end of the spectrum, I thought, what am I going to feel like when I'm interviewing somebody else with very different politics? And I can tell you, every time I did an interview, the word sacred kept coming to mind. And I kept thinking, why sacred? And then I realized finally, it's two things. They're talking about life and death and grief and love, the most important things in life. And they're being so bravely honest and open, and that makes it sacred.
That's where we'll end. What I do want to do is say this idea that you have of this Literacy Veteran Project, Where do people find out about it? How do people participate?
Okay. If you go to the website, the When Johnny and Jane Come Marching.weebly.com, you will see on the home page something called the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home Fund. And this, you can send in a tax-deductible donation, $5, anything would help. What we want to do is use this to spread to every community in this country. Every civilian listen to a vet's story. That way we'll become a war-literate nation. We'll know what we're talking about. We'll break down the isolation through human connection.
Again, the book is When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home. The websites to learn more about just Paula's work is Paula J. Caplan with a C, paulajcaplan.net. And the one on When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home is When Johnny and Jane Come Marching.weebly, WEEBLY.com. You can listen to this week's conversations, many others, at any time during the week by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. For podcast articles and transcripts, join me in pursuit of a world that just might work. Go to TerenceMcNally.net. One word, TerenceMcNally.net, or worldthatjustmightwork.com to the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement, you can sign up at my site or by emailing me at temcnally@mac.com. The podcasts are also available at iTunes. Finally, thank you to Paula J. Caplan. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.